One of the most amazing things about Portugal's revolution is that it happened in just a day. One single day that ended decades of dictatorship. Army captains rose up to free their country from fascism. Their tanks stopped at red lights. The people handed them flowers, and they stuck the flowers down the barrels of their rifles. Basically without firing a shot. It all happened on April the 25th, 1974. The Carnation Revolution. One of the key figures of the revolution was Captain Vasco Lourenço. He was also the only one of the April captains, as they were called, the leaders of the revolution, who continued to lead the movement until Portugal became a democracy.
Before April 25th, I was responsible for liaison operations and mobilization. I coordinated all those actions. Precisely because I had been detected by the authorities, I was forcibly transferred to Ponta Delgada on the island of São Miguel in the Azores. And here I had to be replaced as operations chief by Otelo Saraiva do Carvalho. I stayed in contact with Otelo so he could inform me when the military action would take place. I was prepared, if necessary, to take control of the entire island of São Miguel. Fortunately, no major operation was needed, because we quickly convinced the military authorities to accept our command and accept April 25th.
Back then, Portuguese historian Irene Pimentel was 23 years old. In the hours leading up to the revolution, she was putting up posters in Lisbon against the regime and against the 3 bloody wars it was waging to keep its African colonies, sacrificing the lives of young Portuguese soldiers.
I was an anti-fascist activist, and on the night of April 24th to 25th, 1974, I was putting up posters against the colonial war on the streets of Lisbon. Around 3 a.m. we returned home by car. We drove past Rádio Clube Português, a radio station that was the first to be taken over by the April 25th rebels, the captains. I passed by the street where the station was located just as it was being seized. It was a wonderful process. I felt like I was levitating, along with my colleagues and comrades, and the streets were full of people discussing politics.
Inácio Ludgero was a young photographer who witnessed April the 25th firsthand, capturing moments that would become historic images.
Por volta das 5 da manhã, o meu chefe ligou-me.
Around 5 in the morning, my boss called me to tell me there was a revolution, just like that. So suddenly, it was all so spontaneous. People started hugging the soldiers, who mostly weren't career military officers, but conscripts, doing their mandatory service. They connected with the people. It was a very beautiful feeling. For me, April 25th began at 5:30 in the morning, and I didn't return home until May 1st, 1974.
Another participant in the revolution was Colonel João Andrade de Silva. Back then, he was a young officer in the Armed Forces movement, the group that orchestrated the coup.
It's true that the main driving force behind our mobilization was to end the war, but we also knew, given the structure of the regime, its totalitarian mindset, and its dogmas, that the war couldn't be ended without removing the government.
Their goal wasn't revenge. It was a fresh start. The revolutionaries set out to topple the brutal and outdated Portuguese regime and to turn their country into a democracy.
There's a spirit behind the uprising that seeks freedom and justice for Portugal, but it's not seeking revenge. Nor is it trying to purge through bloodshed what happened in the last 48 years of Portuguese history. That is civilization.
But how did the captain's uprising bring down Western Europe's longest-standing dictatorship in just one day? An empire without glory and without money. The regime that had started back in 1926 cemented its power in 1932 with the rise of leader Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. Backed by the military, Salazar established the so-called Estado Novo, the new state, a fascist one-party dictatorship rooted in ultranationalism and conservative Catholic values. Its motto was God, Fatherland, and Family.
The Estado Novo dictatorship was very successful because from a propaganda standpoint, it managed to convince the Portuguese people that it was finally going to solve the country's major problems, a country that lived in constant hardship.
Portugal lived in extreme poverty and extreme ignorance. There was a 30% illiteracy rate.
Portugal already faced widespread illiteracy and poverty. Now, with the Estado Novo, it also had a repressive moral code that dictated all aspects of daily life.
A minha mãe era casada por igreja.
My mother got married in church and had 2 daughters.
Foi viver com meu pai.
Then she went to live with my father.
Antes do 25 de abril, não podia
Before
fazer.
April 25th, there was no divorce. I was born from that relationship.
Dessa união. Portanto, meu pai era
So my father was a single man who had had a child with a married woman.
Estamos a falar nos anos 50, princípios de 60.
We're talking about the 1950s, early 1960s.
Até ao 25 de abril.
I had it on my ID card until April 25th. I was an illegitimate
Estou a
child.
contar uma experiência pessoal.
I'm sharing a personal
Quando tinha
experience.
que matricular,
Whenever I had to enroll or present my ID somewhere, my documents said illegitimate child.
Ilegítimo.
And most of the Portuguese population accepted it for nearly half a century.
No dictatorship functions solely by repressing and oppressing direct opponents who resist. It also works by seducing the population, offering certain things. For example, using the public administration, which was the main institution providing jobs to the Portuguese. But the state only gave jobs to those who adapted to the dictatorship and were obedient. There was also an organization dedicated to leisure time for the Portuguese, the National Foundation for Work and Joy, heavily inspired by the Nazi model. And with all this, the regime managed to make the general population politically apathetic, apart from the minorities who opposed it. Starting in 1936 or 1937, Salazar tamed the armed forces and soon declared, "You are the armed forces of defense, not only of Portugal, but of the Portuguese regime, and therefore of Salazar's dictatorship."
In the regime's ultra-nationalist ideology, the colonies were crucial. While countries like the UK and France had already lost control of most of their colonies, Portugal was still clinging to the empire it had begun building back in the 15th century. By 1974, it was the world's largest remaining colonial empire. In Asia, Portugal still controlled Macau on the coast of China and East Timor in Southeast Asia. In Africa, it still held on to Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, and São Tomé and Príncipe. To justify continuing this system, the regime leaned heavily on the rhetoric of patriotism.
It turned the Portuguese colonial empire into a defining element of the Portuguese nation, defining its very existence. Therefore, according to the regime's narrative, giving up the colonies would mean Portugal giving up its own national character. It meant that at any moment, it could be swallowed up by Spain in a gulp.
What did Salazar do in 1951? He changed the constitution and declared that the colonial empire and the colonies were no longer a colonial empire. The colonies became Portuguese overseas provinces. It became forbidden to call them colonies or a colonial empire. They had to be called provinces, just like Alentejo.
Though the colonies were officially considered parts of Portugal, they suffered constant exploitation and abuse. The system started to unravel in 1961, when Portuguese colonial troops brutally crushed a protest by Angolan farmers, who were demanding better pay for their cotton. Portuguese forces killed thousands of Angolan protesters in what became known as the Baixa de Caçancha massacre. The event sparked a full-scale armed uprising. In 1963, Guinea-Bissau rose up. In 1964, Mozambique did the same. By the mid-1960s, Portugal was fighting 3 colonial wars at once. These wars were eating up nearly half the national budget, and they required thousands of soldiers. In 1968, Salazar suffered a stroke and was replaced by Marcelo Caetano, one of the regime's top ideologues. At first, Caetano was seen as a reformer, but then, instead of ending the wars, he kept on sending young Portuguese men to kill and be killed.
During the academic year, those who got the worst grades were mobilized to fight in Africa. The top students stayed behind.
Men were required to do mandatory military service that lasted 4 years.
E esse serviço militar dura 4 anos, 2 anos de instrução
2 years of training and 2 years in the colonies at war. There were deaths and injuries. The military personnel themselves, including the professionals from the military academy, began to be systematically sent to fight in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea. In other words, all my friends and companions, boyfriends and brothers, always had a barrier ahead of them. From age 20 onwards, they had to do mandatory military service. So the colonial war began to cause fatigue, but also radical opposition from many young people. After all, what were we defending? They risked dying or being wounded for an unjust cause.
Every year, the regime drafted thousands of young men and sent them to Africa to fight in rugged forests and bushlands.
I went to Guinea in 1969 in command of an operational company, 180 men in a battalion. I stayed in a combat zone in northern Guinea near the border with Senegal, and at first, I went to war convinced I was fulfilling my patriotic duty as a Portuguese citizen. But then something happened that deeply affected me and completely changed my view of the war. I had just discovered a network of spies from the Ghanaian Independence Party who had infiltrated the militias. These were Ghanaian units within the Portuguese army, hired to fight on our side. I uncovered an intelligence network and realized it was led by a militiaman named Bari, who had died in combat next to me in an operation I had carried out about 15 days before discovering the network. I began to question what kind of war this was. one that led someone to put himself in a situation where he ended up dying in an operation from the gunfire of his own comrades. That led to very intense arguments with my officers. I concluded that this was not my war, that I didn't belong there, and that those fighting for their independence were right. Therefore, it was an unjust war. From then on, I spent the rest of my service in Guinea doing containment work and trying not to carry out offensive actions. Although at the end of the war, I was involved in one offensive operation. When I returned after 2 years of war, I was outraged because I had realized I was being used by Portugal's political power for an unjust, senseless war.
People in Portugal had started questioning these wars. Of course, most of the people killed in the wars were African locals. But what really changed public opinion in Portugal were the thousands of young men from Portugal who were killed, and tens of thousands injured, many with horrific wounds.
Today, there are still war invalids with the most severe amputations. Some of the so-called basket men are still alive. They have no arms or legs. They live in a basket. It's incredible. Even today, I have a good friend 2 years older than me who still suffers from war trauma. The other day, he had to be hospitalized. They had to tie him to the bed because he was saying, "They're down there, they're down there, they're coming here to kill us."
There were various ethnic groups, and they barely felt any identification with Portugal. It was very complicated for the military, for us. One day we were socializing with someone who was a friend, and we got along well with the people. And the next day they were shooting at us, and we were shooting at them. It was an impossible war. From a military standpoint, that war was fundamentally flawed. When the war began, the generals said they were going to resolve the issue in 5 years. When I was there in 71, 10 years had passed, and nothing had been resolved.
Officers like João Andrade de Silva were sent to remote territories to fight wars that made no sense to them.
They were the commanding officers at the front. All of that made them much more aware of what the war really meant and of the impossibility of winning it. On top of that, it was very common for captains to serve or to be transferred from one colonial war to another. For example, they would serve for 2 years in Guinea-Bissau, then be sent for another 2 years to Angola, and then another 2 years to Mozambique. In this way, they were the ones who continuously suffered the consequences of the war.
On top of it all was the captain's deep distrust of a regime that in 1961 had abandoned its own troops. That year, India decided to take over Portugal's Indian territories, Goa, Daman, and Diu. India sent 45,000 troops to confront 4,000 Portuguese soldiers. On December the 14th, 1961, Salazar sent a telegram to the governor of Portuguese India, General Manuel Antonio Vassallo e Silva, ordering him to fight to the death. The telegram said, "It's horrible to think this might mean total sacrifice, but I recommend and expect that sacrifice as the only way to remain true to our traditions and give the greatest service to the future of the nation." 3 days later, Indian troops invaded and took the territories.
There were very few armed forces in those colonial enclaves in India. And Salazar said, "We must defend this to the last man." But Vassallo e Silva, who was the general in command there, said no, he wasn't going to do that. He was going to save his men, full stop. And afterwards, he was punished by Salazar for not having fought to the last man.
Senior officers who returned from India were dismissed and expelled from the army. 10 years later, the young captains fighting Portugal's wars in Africa hadn't forgotten what happened in India.
The army sees that the regime is betting solely on a military solution. They see no possibility of a negotiated or political solution. They believe that the regime is going to use the army as a scapegoat.
Their final break with the regime came in 1973 with a new law that many in the military saw as unfair. The law was meant to allow temporary officers with less military education to be promoted quickly and fill shortages in leadership. And it gave them the same status and perks as career officers.
Precisely because the regime needed to find solutions to get communities to go to war, it issued a decree that benefited those who joined, but harmed all those who were already in the armed forces. It wasn't the army, and that's when we took advantage of the discontent caused by this institutional pressure, to draw attention to the fact that the problem wasn't institutional, the problem was political, and therefore the problem was the war.
The decree generates enormous opposition from career officers and makes it easier for officers to begin speaking out about both the decree and everything that's going wrong in the country, and about the need for new solutions to the colonial wars. Unintentionally, the regime itself helps politicize what was initially a mere administrative protest by the army.
In just a few months, the captains concluded that if the colonial wars didn't end, the regime itself had to. And they started preparing their own plan for the country. The plan.
The MFA, the Armed Forces Movement, was doing an important program that can only be described as pre-revolutionary.
Among the many officers in the Armed Forces Movement, 3 stood out: Vasco Lourenço, Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, and Fernando José Salgueiro Maia. All 3 would play key roles in the conspiracy. Back in Portugal, Vasco Lourenço was one of the first to get the ball rolling. He recruited more and more officers into the movement. His resolve quickly spread to others.
I was absolutely determined to do 2 things. One was not to return to the war. As professionals, we spent 2 years at war, came back to Portugal, stayed here for a year, and then returned for another period of service in the war. So I had decided that I would not go back to the war. If necessary, I would desert, but I would not return to war. I also decided that, if I had the opportunity as an officer to use my military knowledge to turn the situation around in Portugal and put an end to the dictatorship that was imposing this war, I would do it. I joined the captains' movement, and on September 9, 1973, there was a major meeting at Monte do Sobral in Évora, where in fact, the person who seemed to me to be the leader of the captains' movement was Vasco Lourenço. He had a heroic tone. Speaking with determination is very important for the military and for the people. It's very important that leaders have a decisive voice and say where we're going and why we're going. Vasco Lourenço, in fact, played this role at the meeting on September 9, 1973, and to me, he was my commander.
Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho was the strategic mind, the one who planned the actual operations for the coup. To figure out what not to do, Otelo studied the failed coup of March the 16th, led by officers loyal to General Antonio de Spínola, who'd also spoken out against the colonial wars. The regime used that failed uprising as an excuse to exile or reassign officers it didn't trust. Vasco Lourenço was sent to the Azores in the middle of the Atlantic. With the rebel officers scattered, the secret police believed there wouldn't be another attempt anytime soon. They were focused on monitoring communists and socialists, not the army.
Around May the 1st, or just before, the secret police are focused on civilians, focused on arresting people, and so on. They aren't paying attention to the military.
That gave Otelo the window he needed to finalize the operation. According to the plan, Captain Salgueiro Maia would be responsible for taking central Lisbon, a crucial task. He and his young soldiers would decide the fate of the entire revolution. Even before anything happened, Prime Minister Marcelo Caetano was already worried about these captains. Otello later quoted him as saying, "Beware of the captains. They're dangerous. They're not old enough to be bought." By April 1974, all that was left to do was figure out how to secretly alert the units involved that the revolution was starting, without tipping off the secret police. One officer proposed using coded messages broadcast through songs on the radio, just like Chilean coup plotters had done in 1973. Otello agreed. The first signal came on April the 24th at 10:55 in the evening. A Lisbon radio host announced the time, 5 to 11, and played a song that had just competed in Eurovision, E Depois do Adeus by Paulo de Carvalho. The second signal, the one that would go down in history, came at 12:20 a.m. On Radio Renascença, a host read the first verse of Grândola Vila Morena, a protest song by dissident singer José Afonso, a song Portuguese soldiers had sung in the forests of Africa.
Grândola Vila Morena.
From that moment, the song became the anthem of the revolution. And everything went exactly as planned. From his headquarters in Potinha, just outside Lisbon, Otello gave the order. At 12:20 a.m., as soon as the radio played Grândola, the units rolled out, seizing airports, government buildings, and key infrastructure.
A partir deste momento, o movimento das Forças Armadas controla totalmente a rede emissora da Rádio e Televisão Portuguesa.
I was on radio duty at the guard's office. I had received the message that everything would begin at 3 in the morning on the 25th, which in the Azores was 1 o'clock, since at that time they were 2 hours behind mainland Portugal. When I tuned in to one station, I heard what I later found out was the first announcement from the armed forces movement. But I only heard the end, when the population was asked not to leave their homes and doctors and nurses were urged to go to the hospitals. I wondered whether it was a message from our side or from the regime, which might have already found out what was happening and issued that order. Then, at the end of the announcement, they played a military march I didn't recognize. So I stayed there for about 3 minutes, like a caged beast, pacing around the office and muttering, "Is it ours or theirs? Is it ours or theirs?" Then the military march stopped, and I heard the announcement repeated, "This is the command post of the armed forces movement." From that moment on, I went crazy, jumping and shouting, "We won, we won, we won!" Because I knew exactly how we were organized. And I was sure that if we already controlled a radio station, it was a sign that we were going to win.
When they took over military bases, the captains gave their commanding officers a choice: join the revolution or stay locked inside their offices. Amazingly, no one was harmed. One of the most critical missions fell to Captain Salgueiro Maia. Leading 500 troops and armored vehicles from the Army's cavalry school in Santarém, he was tasked with taking Lisbon. Hearing Grândola on the radio, Maia gathered his men and said, "Gentlemen, as you all know, there are various types of states. Socialist states, capitalist states, and the state we've come to. So tonight we're going to end the state we've come to. Whoever wants to join me, let's go to Lisbon and put an end to this. If you want to come, step forward and form ranks. If not, stay here." No one stayed behind. They all joined. At dawn, the revolutionaries reached Lisbon and took over the Praça de Comércio, one of the city's central squares, which at the time housed the army ministry. The government scrambled to respond, and when it did, it couldn't find a single unit willing to stop Maia.
Salgueiro Maia played a crucial role at a decisive moment, in the place where April 25th would be determined, Avenida Ribeira das Naus, when a powerful military unit with 7 cavalry tanks tried to confront him in defense of the previous regime. Salgueiro Maia showed heroic resolve. He stood up to those tanks and told General Junqueira dos Reis, who commanded them, that he was mistaken and that they would proceed with the coup. Then the general gave the order to fire, but the second lieutenant didn't shoot, Sotomayor didn't shoot, and Corporal Antunes didn't shoot either. If they had followed that order, if they had fired, everything would have turned out differently.
That's when the soldiers disobeyed. A second lieutenant said, "I'm not going to shoot a fellow soldier. I fought side by side with these people in the colonial war, and now they're telling me to kill a captain?" Junqueira dos Reis then ordered his arrest, and at gunpoint ordered another soldier to shoot. But he disobeyed. There's a photo, a very beautiful image of Salgueiro Maia, when he finally turns around and realizes he has won, keeping his mouth shut so he doesn't cry, because he understands that he has defeated Junqueira dos Reis.
When you review the conversations, not only those that took place on April 25th, but also those during the various attempted coups in the months that followed, you realize that these officers tried at all costs to avoid armed conflict. To a certain extent, this was because they had all endured the hell of the colonial wars and remote jungles in the middle of Africa and had managed to return. And in a way, there was a feeling that it would be tragically absurd to have survived that hell only to die from a gunshot on some street in Lisbon or Porto because someone had lost their nerve.
But Salgueiro Maia didn't lose his cool. Despite all the risks, he managed to stay calm, persuading more and more officers to join the coup. And when the people saw troops and tanks in the streets, they went out to celebrate. But then came the next threat. A warship, the Gago Coutinho, was anchored in the waters next to the square. The ship's commander had received orders from the Navy's deputy chief to fire on the insurgents, but he refused because of the crowds of civilians. In the end, the ship never fired. Colonel Andrade da Silva witnessed the moment that could have turned a peaceful revolution into a bloody massacre.
The frigate Gago Coutinho was a threat to Salgueiro Maia's unit. We were stationed at the top of Cristo Rei, with the cannons ready. It was very important that all of that was resolved as well.
In the square, people shouted victory, freedom, and down with the colonial war. One woman, escorted by a soldier, approached Salgueiro Maia asking for permission to pass through so she could get to her job cleaning at a post office. He replied, "Don't worry. Today and every year from now, April the 25th will be a national holiday." After taking over the ministries, Maia and his troops headed to the Carmu barracks, the headquarters of the National Republican Guard, where dictator Marcelo Caetano was holed up. On the way, in Rocio Square, civilians offered the soldiers bread, cheese, wine, and cigarettes. One of them was Celeste Cairo, a waitress carrying carnations for an event that had been canceled due to the coup. She asked a soldier on a tank, "What's going on here?" "A revolution," he said. She asked, "For better or for worse?" "To end the war and the secret police," the soldier said. Celeste didn't have cigarettes, but she did have the carnations. She handed him one, and he stuck it down the barrel of his rifle. The others followed suit, giving the revolution its name. After hours of marching and standing, the soldiers finally reached the Carmu barracks. There, Maia climbed on top of his armored vehicle and announced over a megaphone that they had 10 minutes to surrender. But they refused. Maia didn't want to storm the building, but he was running out of options. Then Caetano called General Spinola, who denied being part of the coup. Caetano realized he'd lost, but he said he would only surrender to Spinola. Spinola came, and at 5:30 p.m. on April the 25th, he left the barracks with the dictator. Caetano was placed under arrest. The captains had ended 48 years of dictatorship. But one final tragic chapter remained. Just 400 meters away, outside the headquarters of the regime's secret police, the DGS, people had gathered demanding justice. Inside, agents were burning incriminating documents. Around 8 p.m., under orders from DGS Chief Fernando da Silva Paes, the agents opened fire on the crowd, killing 4 people. José James Hartley Barneto, a 38-year-old clerk and father of 4. Fernando Carvalho Gestera, a 17-year-old waiter. João Guilherme Rego Arruda, a 20-year-old philosophy student. And Fernando Luis Barreiros dos Reis, a 23-year-old soldier on leave in Lisbon, the only soldier killed on April the 25th.
Those 4 deaths were very significant because after that it became impossible for the secret police to continue.
That day marked the start of a new era, though it wouldn't be easy. The shadows. The next day, April the 26th, the National Salvation Junta was formed to lead the country until a civilian government could be installed. One of its members was General Costa Gomes, the armed forces movement's favorite to lead the republic. But General Spinola ended up taking the job, even though he'd only recently distanced himself from the regime.
Spinola was more popular, more ambitious than Costa Gomes. And as I used to say to Costa Gomes himself, you rolled out the red carpet, and Spinola, with his enormous ambition, rose to power.
Spinola was a very controversial figure for me. I don't know if he truly wanted Portugal to become a democracy, but in the end, the captain's movement chose him.
Initially, Spinola took advantage of being the person to whom Caetano surrendered, even though the MFA had authorized him to accept the surrender. But later, Spinola wanted to take the lead, and many people thought he had been the one directing the whole operation.
O que se passou foi que o MFA, para ter algum respaldo de legitimação militar,
the captains, looking to gain military legitimacy, sought the support of a general who had also served in Guinea and also believed that the war had no military solution.
By September 1974, Spinola had stepped down. He tried to tighten his control and stop the colonies from becoming independent, but he couldn't. Most of those colonies gained independence the following year, in 1975, except for Macau, which stayed under Portuguese rule until 1999. But it turns out Spinola still wasn't ready to give up on power. The next year, on March 11th, 1975, he took part in a failed coup and had to flee Portugal, first to Spain and later to Brazil.
Spinola had a personal power agenda. That ended up provoking a reaction from other sectors, and what I usually call the qualitative leap toward the left, the radicalization of power and the revolutionary process. Spinola was largely responsible for that.
Throughout 1975, there was a struggle between revolutionary legitimacy and democratic parliamentary legitimacy through elections. But the elections were an overwhelming success, with 95% of the population turning out to vote. Something like that never happened again. The lines were incredibly long. It was the first time people were voting freely.
Elections were held on April the 25th, 1975, exactly 1 year after the revolution. The Socialist Party won big with 38%. The Communist Party, which people expected to do better, got just 12%. Some in the West feared that Portugal, a founding member of NATO, might switch sides.
Up until November 25th, 1975, the US was afraid that Portugal would fall into the Soviet sphere of influence. Remember that the ones in power at the time were Nixon and Kissinger. There came a moment when Kissinger said, "It's going to become a European Cuba, and we're going to use Portugal as a vaccine against all the communists and leftists in Europe."
But that's not what the captains wanted.
We had no connection with the Communist Party. We wanted to solve concrete problems. We wanted democracy and a just society with real equality. Personally, I didn't know Cuba or Russia, and I believe none of us knew those countries. Most of my comrades had no ties to any political party.
But divisions were growing, both in the army and in society, between those who backed parliamentary democracy and the more radical left. Big businesses, who were afraid their property might be confiscated by the state, started moving their money out of the country. Then the provisional government nationalized the banks. In the Alentejo region, tensions were rising between the wealthy elite who owned most of the land and the farmers who worked their land. Farmers' unions started occupying the estates, and the armed forces movement had to step in to prevent violent clashes. In June 1975, Lieutenant Andrade de Silva urged the farmers to stop the occupations and to put their trust in the government's plan to redistribute the farmland.
Foram vocês que decidiram a reforma agrária. Foram vocês que a pressionaram através das ocupações que tiveram a sua época na vida das sociedades, na nossa história, na história dos povos, tudo tem a sua época. Portanto, meus amigos, neste momento, é a época das ocupações, daquela luta que vocês fizeram contra o capital, luta importante na altura em que foi desencadeada, está ultrapassada. Neste momento, a palavra de ordem é esta: unirem-se para fazer a reforma agrária.
But tensions inside the army were growing. Vasco Lourenço joined the so-called Group of Nine, which rejected radical socialism and pushed for pluralist democracy, while Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho and his allies leaned further left. On November the 24th, Otelo was removed from command in Lisbon and replaced by Lourenço. The next day, paratroopers linked to the radical left seized several air bases. After hours of chaos, loyalist troops regained control.
On November 25th, I was in command of the Group of Nine, the ones that came out victorious. We responded, and the leftists didn't realize what was happening. They didn't surrender quickly. They were willing to tolerate 3 fatalities, playing into the hands of the right wing that wanted blood. But fortunately, we avoided civil war. As I often say, the worst didn't happen. We went through several attempted coups from the right, always led by Spínola. Then there was a shift to the left, a radicalization. And then on November 25th, there was a moment of clarification. Because on November 25th, we managed to stop radicalization, to stop those who apparently wanted to use force to impose a solution of the Soviet or popular power type. But we also stopped those who wanted to return to the past, to dictatorship. So, on November 25th, we managed to clarify the situation, to reclaim April 25th, and to create the conditions to approve the Constitution of the Republic and establish the democracy that is 52 years old today.
Despite the conflicts, the spirit of April 25th lived on even between apparent rivals like Otelo and Lourenço. The revolution that succeeded. In 1976, a new constitution was adopted. The socialists won elections again. Their leader, Mário Soares, became prime minister. From then on, Portugal finally stepped onto the path of stability and progress, just as the young captains had hoped, who risked so much on April the 25th, 1974.
I lived under a dictatorship for 23 years, and that dictatorship ended. That gives us hope that things can change. There are setbacks, but then there are advances, even if we later fall back again.
Unfortunately, people's memory is often very short, and they easily forget the past. And we are witnessing the resurgence of extremist forces that seem to want to copy what happened, for example, in Hitler's Germany. It is by coming together to defend the values of April, the values of freedom, peace, equality, democracy, and justice, especially social justice, that we defend democratic solutions.
A revolution that establishes democracy, where there's a popular vote, where young people increasingly participate in elections. It's a right we've gained, one we didn't have before.
I talk more about a just society with rights, responsibilities, and development.
That this was resolved without a bloodbath turns the entire revolution into an example of civilization. And what's striking is that it was carried out by the military, an anomaly, I dare say, in the history of humanity. The captains of April 25th risked everything and succeeded, setting Portugal on the path towards democracy.
Now it's up to the next generation to keep their legacy alive.
Grandola Vila Morena, terra da fraternidade. Jurei ter por companheira a sombra de uma azinheira que já não sabia a idade.